Thank you so much. Great opening statements. I appreciate that you stayed in the time frame as well, because now we have actually time for discussion. And to me, it is really a puzzling situation, right? On the one hand side, we have now public sector representatives making the case for more experimentation and innovation, and private company representatives. I know you speak in personal capacity today, but just to make the case, basically asking for more rule of law and for more certainty. And that's kind of an interesting puzzle to solve, I think. Also, as we've heard from Sandy, of course, as we're moving in an environment where private actors play such an important role in kind of enabling these technologies and providing the data infrastructure that we need. So I'd like to start actually with your provocation and ask our panelists to comment on the question, okay, what's the role of companies and what is their responsibility as we move into these hybrid environments and of course have the potential on the one hand side to use location data for the public good, but then also have these potential costs and downsides. So since you were so well managed with your time, shall we start with you, Steve?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that I've got 30 years in government, and I trust myself with other people's data, right? So we all think like that, right? So it's all the aggregation of data and individual personalization of data is fine, because I know that I'll use it well. But I don't really trust him, but I know that I can use it well, right? So, and now we have the situation where the government is the regulator and the user. And so that's really what confounds the conversation. And look, I'm not as much of an expert as the other two folks are. I would just suggest that, that the rules that Sandy set out are good ones to follow. But I'm on the other side of this in the following sense, that we're doing so much harm. We could do so much good by using the information that's available now that I don't want to paralyze that conversation while we concurrently look at the role of the regulator setting these rules. So I acknowledge the problem. You know, 15 years ago or whatever it was, I was very active in the world of child support enforcement. I was also active in the world of personalized city services, right? So if I got the right people to help me personalize my services that I wanted to deliver to them, I knew which ones were delinquent in their child support and I could go arrest them, right? So, and I can do that in every single exercise, right? Because every personalization allows you to do something good, and it also allows you to exploit that information if you wish. And sometimes that exploitation is legitimate and sometimes it isn't, and those rules have to be set and enforced, but I'm not sure government is inherently, I mean, we're at a kind of a circular conversation in a way, right? Because there has to be some mechanism to set those rules that apply to me in government even while I'm enforcing those rules. Here, you can, you know, I don't want to give, on either end of this conversation is doom. I think I'm going to give the microphone to Nigel, who will explain how you can trust those of us who are in government.
I also have a specific question for you, actually,
okay.
Just as a follow-up on what Steve just described, and that is you put emphasis on experimentation and, you know, learning fast and rapid prototyping in a way. Does that also apply to policy making, finding the appropriate frameworks, which may actually help to solve this problem, right? That while you're a user as a government, actually you learn a lot also about the appropriate policies. Yes. Is that reflected in your experience?
That's it, precisely. I think that one of the things that we can actually do with these tools is, like when I talk about experimentation, I'm not just talking about you know, doing things faster, better, cheaper. I'm also talking about, because our entire focus is about that relationship of trust between government and the public. So it means that the questions of, like, what is the role of government and what is private versus public are very much part of that experimentation. And so that these questions of policy are very much part of the experimentation itself, right? So so in that case, the kinds of things that we do might differ than what you see a startup or a technology firm doing. But we're very much interested also in airing and in the debate as to what do we want to do with these things, and we can learn. The way to do that is to try a few of them and to learn from that and to make that very explicit when you're connecting with people, that that's the intention here. It's not just about, again, like faster, better, cheaper, although that's not a bad thing, but it's also very much, are you comfortable with this mode of interaction? How do you want us to connect with you? What is too much? What is too little? And so on. So I think experimentation at the public policy level is in fact key.
So Sandy, we've talked now about the role of policy making and policies to safeguard and address some of the challenges, of course, but also to foster the potential of location information. Now, obviously, in the toolbox, there are more tools than just policy making. Technology is another important component, how we can regulate, as we learned from the discussion about cyber law over the past decade. And I was wondering, what's the role of technology and technological evolution in all these debates? Do you see that some of the solutions may be driven by technology, for instance, in response to privacy? You made a few references, right? You mentioned.
So first of all, what Nigel said is exactly right, and that's what we're trying to do is look at the coevolution of policy, technology, and consumers or citizens and how those things fit together. Because you can make up all sorts of terrible stories, but you have to actually try it out. The role of technology, though, I think is a big one, because you have to, the way things are today are not the way they have to be. You can have data stores that are striped across different jurisdictions so that no one government can get a hold of the data. You can make data auditable, whereby you can tell when someone's been doing something that you didn't agree to. You can have recommendation engines about the permissions and the things that you agree to as to what's best practice. So there's a lot of ways where you can make things work better. I think one of the interesting things to think about is there's this notion that one of your colleagues has become identified, which is that computer code is the same thing as law. It's sort of the
Code is law.
Code is law, right? So the way you can actually write really detailed rules for how things happen and verify that they happen automatically, and that's really an extension of policy, right? And you have to be careful because people can break the law, right? But there are ways to think about that from the technology side.
So, Emily, what do you think? 3 approaches sketched, 3 tools. Does it help to answer your question? Or do we miss one important player here?
No, I mean, I think part of it is I couldn't say something that will definitely work. This is an ongoing conversation that I think that we're having as a company. I mean, I definitely take the point that innovation can't stop while we figure this out, and certainly as a company, that's not the space that we sit in. I do think, and to your first point about why would it be the company, that it's because the company is increasingly the intermediary in a lot of these issues, and we get pressure from both sides, from governments, and much more pressure now more than before, because governments you would never imagine now have CIOs. Governments you would never imagine now have people who are very savvy in technology. So I think because of the increasing pressure, we are in a position where we are at the sharp and pointy end. We're both innovating and also sort of seeing the end result of the innovation in a way that could kill the innovation that we're trying to support.
Well, I just want to make this, my goal is to make this question impossibly complicated, so complicated it can't be answered. So let me just deal with a real situation in what I spent like last 15 years working on. So it's abused children, right? So if we know everything that happens in that neighborhood, and we can find out huge amounts of information in that neighborhood, we find out everything that happened in that family, and we have a social worker in the school. We know school attendance records, right? We know health records about the family and the kid, right? We know abuse records that are reported to formal authorities. We know what's happened in the next door neighbor from the number of police reports, right? We have a huge amount of information. And if we allow, and you can have it rule driven like Sandy mentioned, so, but we'll now be able to paint a picture that is, when connected with data analytics, will dramatically help us produce better outcomes for the kids and dramatically invade the privacy of the people we're investigating, right? And either way you move on that, there's a legitimate issue and right that gets hurt. And so that's why it's so difficult to kind of referee.
So for instance, in the things we did in the Ivory Coast, and the things you are mentioning here and you were mentioning earlier, the fundamental problem is that increased transparency brings to us problems that we can't resolve without really extensive debate. It's going to hurt one side or the other. We have traditions that are sometimes millennia long that are confronted by the data. And that's a tense discussion. But I'd like to try and keep things like that on one side, because those are things about what we want, their values questions, their ethics questions. There's also things where we have a lot of agreement about ethics and morality, and we can actually move forward with those while we're still debating the other ones.
Excellent. Let me open up here. We have one question from the gentleman here in the middle. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. I have a question. In the United States, there's something called a green button program. It was, I think, Anish Chopra, when he was U.S. CTO, started it. I mean, I don't think there was federal legislation, but he sort of championed it, and I think the state of California, I know PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, Southern Cal Edison have implemented it, and I think there's three really key things. One is, number one, that the electric power usage data collected by smart meters, I own that. As a consumer, I own that, even though the power company is actually holding it. Mm-hmm. I can authorize that data to be made available to a third party so that they can do interesting things with it, develop cool apps and so on, and I can revoke it. And I'm just wondering whether you think that is a model for sharing data that is held by an institution.
That is the fundamental model that you see coming up in the EU and in the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. However, there's one more thing, which is in a normal ecosystem, that data is then sent to other people to do other things. And you may not know about that. And so there has to be auditing of where else it goes and your ability to revoke that also.
Do you mean an anonymized version of my data, or do you mean my data with my identity?
Our company may send your data to somebody to do an analysis, and they may send it to somebody else. And in that process, what actually happens is the original context of the permissions gets lost. You don't know it. They may not even know it. But if you have a system that requires auditing, you can find out about it, at least. At least that's the theory.
Even that one, I'm not going to talk about each one, but even that one's complicated. I mean, so you don't hit the button, and I'm the public official regulating PG&E, and we have an electrical shortage. I want to find out how, I want to be able to manage your electrical consumption so your neighbor's electricity doesn't go out. I mean, we can think of real situations, right, where we're using a smart grid to manage your consumption. To opting your information out of the system makes it more difficult to manage it across the rest of the system. It's not an obvious answer. It's obvious that, oh, period. I don't want to talk too long. I'm taking your mic.
Sorry. Just a very brief follow-up, because we have other people with questions.
Our mic. I'll use this.
So I actually, the dismal and gloom part, I think is a little different than where you placed it. And this is sort of a challenge. I'm hearing is that, you know, policy is like trying to sweep back the tide. And the only thing that I've really heard that is consistent and actually has agreement on are principles. But the policy is something that runs around sweeping up after technology and innovation. And, you know, so is there actually a leading role for policy, or is that always going to be, and do we need to acknowledge that that's, you know, the cleanup action?
Go ahead. So I think it is how we think about policy, right? I think that we have a traditional model of policy development that's sort of, you know, sort of after the fact, right? That then is sort of trying to sweep up after the damage has been done, or between after the horse is out of the barn. But I think that there's a different way to thinking about that, right? There's a way of, as we were talking about, sort of these an experimental approach to public policy, so that we're evolving our thinking as technologies are deploying, as we're seeing them deploy in society, so that we're learning along the way. And so I think it becomes important then that we have institutions that can operate in this way, right? So that sort of thinking outside of the traditional legislative approach. Again, I think sort of local government can lead the way in terms of framing that basic methodology. But I think that there's much, like when you, this is as much a structural problem in how we develop laws as it is a technical problem, and I think we just need to rethink some of the structural elements of our policy-making technology.
You can hope for neck and neck.
I think so. I mean, at some level, policy should always be following behind, the public debate. Like, what do people think about something, right? Policy can't really, sort of happen in advance of that. But I think that it could certainly be learning along the way, so that by the time, like in the conventional mode now, sort of all the policy analysis kind of happens at the end. And again, I'm making blanket statements here, and in certain domains it's not true. But like in sort of the context in which we're talking, I think that reframing when we think about the learning coming through the as to how policy relates to these things, I think can be restructured.
Just one quick point, just as a practical matter, just having people like Nigel, having people like Sandy involved in government, I think, so if you've had conversations sort of across the world with policymakers, you will be surprised at how little many of them know about technology. And I think that's starting to change. And so the more you have people who are actually from tech or who understand technology, I think you'll start to see some of the policy making. I mean, you can't always anticipate everything, but at least it'll be much better informed.
I mean, one of the problems with all these things is getting everybody informed, citizens, policymakers, and this idea of having experimental approach to it is, I think, key. So a lot of what we've been doing is getting, safe harbor from government to go experiment. And what that does is that generates data about what works and what doesn't work and how do people feel about it. And that's really important in deciding policy. The other thing I hear from some of the most senior policy people is that they know that they can't keep up with technology. So what they want to specify is a level of protection, not how you achieve it. Right? So you say, well, look, here's the bar you have to hit, and however you hit it. That's the principle, and the way you prove it is you do an experiment, and they'll give you safe harbor for you to show that your thing actually works and achieves that bar. That's actually not so bad, right? Because you don't get huge disasters that way. You get small disasters, right?
We're running out of time, but one last quick question, and please quick answers too. Thanks.
So it seems a really strong message coming out of this panel, and I'm kind of, this is kind of bringing together lots of thoughts from across the conference, is that this idea of iterative, experimental approaches to involving the public, in this decision about the best way forward, and obviously a very complicated and evolving space, discussions about privacy and what should be released. And I wonder if, so I'm thinking, on the Nigel scale, we've got a really wonderful example of iterative, communicative approach at the city level. And Global Pulse is talking about it, and Sandy is talking about it at kind of this data common seems like the beginning of maybe what could be a sort of global scale experimental conversation about what gets released and what doesn't. Maybe it's my own ignorance, but I don't have a clear picture of what the U.S. federal government is doing sort of experimentally in this kind of engaging way. And I would love to, I'd love to hear ideas about how that might work. And I see, wonderful, and I think Yahoo's question is, perfect. And that's from, from a software development perspective, we know that very short iterative times work really well for communicating with a customer about what gets built. And clearly that's getting applied to this public policy space, and it just makes so much sense because we're talking about technology and we're talking about educating the public, and it just seems like that's the way forward. And how is the U.S. government doing this?
It's almost like a panel summary, but I want to give you the opportunity to respond quickly to this provocation.
So, mostly talking to industry side, larger, more developed countries are not in the lead in this because the politics are very polarized. What they're looking for is smaller governance like Trento, which is an autonomous region in Italy, or Luxembourg, or Singapore, to actually make first steps in these directions because they're small enough that they can actually do it. And so the people that come through my office are not from the US, they're not from the UK, they're not from France or Germany, they're from little small states that are equally as developed as the United States.
Why is it politically difficult to talk about experimenting and to try things that are
Why is it difficult
somewhat
to
safe?
talk about gun control?
All right, you don't want to go there.
No, I mean, you know, people are at each other's throats. It's just very difficult.
Maybe final thoughts from the panelists, Nigel?
I think that we're just in the early days of thinking through how an experimental approach to public policy can be deployed. I think, you know, when you talk about the federal government, there's a lot of stuff to work through, right? These huge bureaucracies just aren't set up to operate in this way. At the local level, honestly, I think there's a lot more flexibility and agility. You know, I see Sandy like every other day now, so I can, you know, so there's this opportunity for these very deep, sort of quick, lightweight collaborations. And so I think when you think about the U.S., you know, I think Stephen might say something similar, but I think that I have a lot of hope, you know, at the city-to-city level, and then working upwards from there.
Stephen, the government as a learning organization, are you also an optimist like Nigel?
Yeah, I'm an optimist, and I think the positive externalities exceed the negative externalities, right? Because what I'm looking for is that we have a form of professionalism in the U.S. government that's defined by one really smart person sitting in a government vertical who can see all the data that he can possibly get and makes a decision about what's in somebody else's best interest. I'm trying to move to a model that socializes the information. We actually get back to crowdsourcing, and I think that the exchange of information, and particularly in the iterative, innovative way we're talking about, will actually, again, involve people in making decisions about their own lives. And there is enough risk of privacy inside the current professional system that I think the positive externalities of socializing information and getting communities to work together, co-production of services, actually exceeds the negative that could come with it.
I want to ask the final question to you. Now, we've recognized that companies and private actors are equally important stakeholders in all this, perhaps even more important stakeholders. You have vast experience in experimentation with private policy making overall. What can we learn from you as governments?
Well, I mean, I think a big thing is awareness. I mean, these are all very, very difficult questions, and so we've talked about them. We've made it clear that there are no easy answers. I think one of the things that we've learned as a company, having have learned it actually the difficult way. We've learned as a company is that a lot of times just being aware enough to ask the question takes you further. So just being aware enough and making sure that your developers, your engineers, anyone who's involved in creating or deploying the technology knows enough about the issues to ask the questions before releasing a particular product.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists. With that, over to Kevin, I believe. Thank you.